At my daughter's wedding shower, her future mother-in-law grabbed my late wife's shawl right off my shoulders and threw it on the floor like it was trash. "Sweetheart, that thing smells like a thrift store," she said loud enough for 80 people to hear. Then, she saw the embroidery on the inside collar, and her wine glass slipped right out of her hand. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, and her whole face had gone the color of the tablecloth. In about 4 seconds, the happiest night of my daughter's life turned into something none of us would ever forget. I want to thank you for being here with me tonight, wherever you're listening from. Truck stop, kitchen table, night shift break room, doesn't matter. Tell me where you're tuning in from down in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me tell you how a torn-up piece of fabric ended up cracking open a secret that had been buried for 29 years. A few of the details in this story have been changed to protect the people in it, and some moments have been shaped for the sake of telling it right. But every word of the lesson is true, and I think you'll feel that as we go. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 66 years old, and I've spent 41 of those years running a small engine repair shop off Route 9 outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Lawnmowers, generators, the occasional outboard motor somebody dragged in on a trailer. It's not glamorous work. My hands haven't been fully clean since Nixon was in office. But that night, standing in the ballroom of the Whitfield Country Club in my one good suit, I had something folded inside my breast pocket that mattered more than every engine I'd ever fixed put together. My daughter Grace called me 2 nights before the shower, so excited I could barely get a word in. "Dad, I want you to wear Mom's shawl, just for a little while. I know it's silly, but I want her there somehow." I told her it wasn't silly at all. I'd kept that shawl in a cedar box in my closet since my wife Ruth passed 6 years back, and I hadn't taken it out since her funeral. But my daughter asked, and there wasn't a thing in this world I wouldn't do for her. Grace is 26. She's marrying a young man named Preston Ashford, whose family owns Ashford Textiles, a company with mills across 3 states, and a name that shows up in the business section of the Harrisburg paper more often than the weather. Preston himself is a decent enough kid, quiet, works in operations for his father's company, and I believe he genuinely loves my daughter. His mother, Diane Ashford, is a different story entirely. The first time I met Diane, she looked at my truck in the driveway the way you'd look at something that had wandered in off the highway. She has this way of talking to people in the trades, plumbers, mechanics, landscapers, like she's doing them a favor by acknowledging they exist. I've dealt with plenty of customers like her over the years. You learn to let it roll off. But watching how she treated my daughter, that was harder to swallow. Before I tell you what happened in that ballroom, I need to take you somewhere else first. Because if you don't understand where I come from, none of what happened that night will land the way it should. I grew up in a town called Millport Hollow, about 30 minutes northeast of where I live now. It's not the kind of place you'd find on a postcard. Small houses, a lumber mill that closed down when I was 19, and a creek that runs behind the old cemetery where 3 generations of Kesslers are buried under handmade headstones. My father worked that lumber mill for 22 years before it shut its doors, and after that he did whatever work he could find to keep food on the table. He taught me 2 things that stuck with me my whole life. Work with your hands like it matters, because it does, and never let anybody make you feel small for the work you do. I met Ruth when I was 23. She was working behind the counter at a diner in town, and I came in every single morning for coffee I didn't need, just so I could see her for 5 minutes. She had this laugh that made you feel like you'd said the funniest thing anybody ever said, even when you hadn't. I proposed to her on the porch of her parents' house with a ring I'd made myself out of a piece of silver wire, because I didn't have 2 nickels to rub together back then. She wore that wire ring for 3 years until I could afford a real one, and she kept the old one in a drawer for the rest of her life. She used to say it reminded her that love doesn't need money to be real, it just needs somebody who shows up. Grace was born in the back bedroom of a rented house because we couldn't afford the hospital bill, and the midwife, 2 streets over, owed my father a favor from years back. Ruth held our daughter in her arms that night and told me she'd never been so scared or so happy in her whole life. That house, that creek, that little town, it made us who we are. And it's the reason Grace grew up, understanding that a person's worth has nothing to do with the size of their bank account. Now, I need to tell you about the shawl, because that's really where this story begins. Ruth started making that shawl the year Grace turned 16. She wasn't a professional seamstress, just a woman who liked to keep her hands busy in the evenings, and she'd taught herself embroidery from library books the same way I taught myself to read a diesel engine. She worked on that shawl off and on for almost 2 years, deep green wool with a pattern of vines stitched along the border, and on the inside collar, hidden where you'd never notice unless you were looking, she stitched a set of initials and a date. She never told me what they meant. I asked her once, and she just smiled and said some things are between a woman and her own history. I let it go. 43 years of marriage teaches you which doors not to push on. Ruth wore that shawl to Grace's high school graduation, to our 40th anniversary dinner at the Millport Grange Hall, and to her sister's funeral, where she stood at the graveside with it wrapped around her shoulders in the cold October wind. When she passed, I folded it into a cedar box, and I hadn't touched it since, not until Grace called and asked me to bring a piece of her mother to the shower. The trouble started brewing about 4 months before that night, though I didn't understand what I was looking at until much later. Grace works as a paralegal at a firm downtown, and she'd mentioned once, just in passing over Sunday dinner, that Ashford Textiles was in the middle of some kind of restructuring. Preston had gone quiet about it, she said, wouldn't talk details, which wasn't like him. I didn't think much of it at the time. Rich people's business problems weren't exactly my department. But then, one evening in early spring, my neighbor Hank Willoughby showed up at my shop with a piece of paper in his hand, looking like somebody had insulted his mother. Hank's family has owned the plot of land next to the old Millport Cemetery for 3 generations, right along the creek, same as us. "Walt," he said, "you seen this?" It was a letter from a company called Ashford Land Holdings, addressed to property owners along Millport Creek, talking about a proposed acquisition for what they called a mixed-use development opportunity. Real polite, real official sounding, the kind of language built to say a whole lot while committing to nothing. I took that letter home and read it 3 times at my kitchen table. Ashford Land Holdings. I'd seen that name once before, stitched into the corner of a brochure sitting on a table at Preston's parents' anniversary party the year before, right next to renderings of some glass and steel development they were proud of. I got on my computer that night and started digging through the county property records, which are public information if you know where to look. And what I found over the next few hours put a knot in my stomach the size of a fist. Ashford Land Holdings had been quietly buying up parcels around Millport Hollow for almost 2 years. Corner lots, vacant land along the creek, 2 of the old storefronts on Main Street. They were assembling the pieces slowly, carefully, the way you'd build a fence 1 post at a time so nobody notices until it's already closed around you. And then I found something that stopped my heart cold. A community liaison agreement, filed 8 months earlier, listing a local contact who had provided site access, neighborhood surveys, and boundary documentation to help the acquisition team move things along. The name on that agreement was Preston Ashford. I sat there in my kitchen a long time. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. I thought about Preston sitting at my table eating Ruth's old cornbread recipe that Grace had learned to make, walking through Millport Hollow with Grace pointing out the creek where her grandfather used to fish, and then going home and handing his family's company a map of exactly what they needed to take it all away. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me. I didn't know yet whether Preston understood what his father's company was really planning to do with that land, whether he'd been used, or whether he was in on it with his eyes wide open. I decided I wasn't going to find out by yelling. I was going to find out the way my father taught me to find out anything worth knowing, quietly and with proof in hand before I opened my mouth. The first call I made was to a woman named Eleanor Wraith, an attorney in Harrisburg who specialized in historic preservation law. I'd found her name doing research at the county library, the same library where Ruth used to check out books on embroidery. I told Eleanor about the cemetery, the creek, the community garden. 3 families had worked together for over 60 years. She told me that if what I was describing held up, we had solid grounds for a historic preservation nomination, and that filing it would trigger an automatic hold on any demolition or major alteration while the review was pending. It wouldn't happen overnight, she said. The review process takes months, but it would buy us time, and time was the one thing I needed most. I spent the next several weeks working with Eleanor after my shifts at the shop closed. Hank Willoughby dug shoeboxes of old photographs out of his attic, going back to the 1940s. 3 other families found deeds and church records and hand-drawn maps of the old property lines. I wrote my own account of the cemetery and walked every row I could find, writing down every name I recognized on those handmade headstones, including my own father's, Walter Kessler, buried under an oak tree that was already old when he was a boy. The second thing I did was invite Preston fishing, not to confront him, just to see what kind of man he really was when nobody important was watching. He said yes, which surprised me. We sat on the creek bank on a Saturday morning in early summer, and I watched him check his phone more than he watched the water. After about an hour, I set my rod down and asked him if he remembered the bend in the creek where the water slows down. He said his grandfather used to fish there too, before the family moved on to bigger things. I told him that slow water is where things settle, where things stay. Then I told him not to let anybody talk him out of the place that made him who he was, no matter what it cost to hold on to it. He looked at me for a long moment and said I worried too much, and went back to his phone. We didn't talk much after that. The third thing happened almost by accident, and it changed everything. I drove Grace to her doctor's appointment one Thursday afternoon in late June, the way I always did since her mother passed, and I figured somebody in the family ought to sit in that waiting room with her. That day was different because of who walked through the door. The doctor who stepped into the hallway wasn't Grace's usual physician. He was older, silver hair, the kind of careful, steady bearing you only get from decades in an operating room. He was mid-conversation with a nurse when he turned and nearly collided with a woman stepping out of the exam room ahead of us, a woman I didn't recognize at first because her back was to me. He stopped. He looked at her, not the way a stranger looks at someone they almost bumped into. Something else. A stillness. A flicker of recognition that didn't quite finish forming. His eyes dropped for just a fraction of a second to where her collar met her neck. The woman apologized, stepped aside, and he apologized back, but he didn't move right away. He stood there, half a second too long before he continued down the hallway. I was sitting across the waiting room. I saw the whole thing, and when the woman turned around, I realized it was Diane Ashford, sitting in the exact same clinic as my daughter, waiting on some appointment of her own. I made a note of the doctor's name posted outside the consultation room. Dr. Aaron Voss. That night I looked him up and learned he was the retired chief of transplant surgery at Harrisburg General, now working part-time as a consultant, and that over the last decade he'd appeared as a guest at 3 separate charity galas hosted by none other than the Ashford family. I sat back in my chair and felt something shift in my chest. Not quite fear, more like the moment before a storm breaks, when the air goes still and heavy, and everything gets very clear all at once. I want to stop here for a moment. Because to really understand what happened at that shower, you need to know something about my wife that I myself didn't learn until the night everything came apart. Something she carried alone for 29 years. It was the spring of 1996. Grace was 3 years old. We didn't have much money, and Ruth had picked up a part-time job at the gift counter at Harrisburg General to help cover the bills, which came with a discount on routine checkups through the hospital's staff wellness program. One afternoon, she went in for a standard blood pressure screening. On her way out, she passed the nurse's station and overheard 2 nurses talking in low, tight voices, the kind of voices that mean something is wrong. They just admitted a man in his 30s with 2 young children, and his wife was already crying in the waiting room. His kidneys had failed. He needed a transplant urgently. His blood type was rare, and there was no match on the registry. Ruth told me all of this 29 years later, sitting at our kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she never drank. She said she stood in that hallway thinking about the wife sitting in the waiting room, thinking about what it would feel like to be in that chair not knowing. Then she walked up to the nursing station and asked if they could test her. She was a match. She didn't call me. She didn't go home first. She signed the consent forms that same afternoon, was admitted the next morning, and told me she was having a minor procedure for a cyst her doctor had flagged at her last checkup. She had the whole story ready. She knew I would have stopped her if she'd told me the truth, and she'd already decided that wasn't going to happen. The surgery took nearly 5 hours. Her recovery was harder than the doctors expected, with complications from fluid retention and blood pressure that wouldn't settle. She was in the hospital 4 days, not one night like she'd told me. She'd asked Dr. Voss, the surgeon who performed it, not to contact me under any circumstances. He disagreed with her decision. He told her so plainly, but he respected it. I learned all of this the morning after the shower. I sat across from my wife's memory at that same kitchen table where she used to sit, except now it was just me and the empty chair, because Ruth had told me this story only once, 3 years before she died, when a scare with her own kidneys had finally shaken it loose. I hadn't understood why she'd never told me sooner. That night at the shower, I finally understood everything. I want you to sit with me here for one more moment before we go back to that ballroom. While Ruth was recovering in a hospital room with instructions not to call her husband, a man named Charles Ashford was waking up from surgery with a future he never expected to have. He was 32 years old. He had a wife named Diane and a 2-year-old son named Preston. The doctors told him the transplant had been successful. They told him the donor wished to remain anonymous. They told him he was a lucky man. He didn't feel lucky, he told Dr. Voss years later, that he felt like a man who'd been handed something he hadn't earned and didn't know how to carry. In the years that followed, Charles Ashford built his textile company into something substantial, raised his son, attended his galas and his golf tournaments, and also, according to what Dr. Voss told me later, hired investigators twice over 2 decades trying to find the person who'd saved his life. Both times, they came back empty. The hospital's anonymity protocols, which Dr. Voss had guarded like a vault, held firm. What Charles did with that failure was start a quiet fund he never publicized, donating every year to transplant research and to families who couldn't afford the costs that come with organ failure. 22 years of checks nobody ever saw. Diane knew about the kidney. Charles had told her himself, sitting at their own kitchen table one evening not long after they married. He told her he owed his life to a stranger he'd never been able to find, the one thing in his life he couldn't fix with money. Diane listened. She said that's very sad, and went back to whatever she'd been doing. She never connected her husband's story to a woman scrubbing counters or driving a battered truck to family functions. She'd glimpsed the edge of a scar once, years before, when Ruth's collar had slipped during a holiday visit, and she'd looked away and never thought of it again. Charles Ashford had 29 years because my wife stood in a hospital hallway and couldn't turn away from another family's suffering. And now his own company was quietly trying to take the land where her memory still lived, where her husband still walked the same creek bank every autumn. He didn't know that. I have to remind myself of that constantly. He didn't know the woman he was trying to displace was the same woman who made his whole life after 1996 possible. But I knew. And what I did with that knowledge was going to shape everything that came next. 2 days before the shower, I made 2 phone calls I hadn't told anyone about until right now. The first was to a reporter named Danny Ruiz at the Harrisburg Sentinel, who'd written 3 pieces that year about development disputes and neighborhoods getting squeezed out from under the people who built them. I told him what I had: a century-old cemetery, a creek corridor that had fed 3 generations of families, and a community liaison agreement with a familiar name attached. He asked when we could meet. We sat down at a diner on 2nd Street that afternoon, and I brought copies, never originals, of everything Eleanor Wraith and I had assembled. He read for 20 minutes without saying a word, then looked up and asked if the preservation nomination was official yet. I told him it would be by morning. The second call was to Eleanor's office to finalize the filing. She submitted it electronically at 6:40 the next morning. 51 pages of documentation, photographs, family testimonies, church records going back generations. The automatic hold took effect the moment it was filed. Ashford Land Holdings could not touch that land while the nomination sat under review, and that review would take a minimum of 90 days. I printed the confirmation, folded it into an envelope with a summary of the filing, and slid it into the breast pocket of my one good suit, right next to my heart, where it stayed until the night of the shower. The morning of the shower, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, straightening my tie, and I opened the cedar box on the dresser and lifted out Ruth's shawl for the first time in 6 years. It still smelled faintly like her, like lavender and the cedar it had been folded in. I draped it over my shoulders the way Grace had asked, feeling foolish and grateful all at once, and I put the envelope in my breast pocket where it belonged. Now let's go back to that ballroom. The Whitfield Country Club had string lights strung across the ceiling and round tables dressed in white linen, and the Ashford family held court near the head table like the room had always belonged to them, which for the purposes of that evening it had. Diane had chosen the venue, the flowers, the string quartet playing something soft enough to sound expensive. Grace looked radiant in a pale blue dress, moving between tables, greeting guests, and every time she caught my eye across the room she smiled, the exact same smile her mother used to give me. I found a seat near the back with Hank Willoughby's daughter and a few of Grace's co-workers, not the worst seats in the room, but not close to where the Ashfords held their conversation either. I noticed the placement. I let it go. For the first hour, nobody at the head table asked me a single question. Not where I lived, not what I did for a living, not one thing about the man who'd raised the bride. In that room, I was scenery. Diane told a long story about a renovation on their lake house. Charles talked about a golf trip to a course in Scottsdale. Preston laughed at everything they said. A laugh I was starting to recognize as something closer to habit than joy. Then Diane's eyes landed on the shawl draped over my shoulders, and something in her expression sharpened. "Walter," she said, loud enough for the nearby tables to catch it, "that's an interesting choice for tonight. Is that a family heirloom? Or did it come from one of those vintage shops downtown?" A few people near her laughed the polite, uncertain laugh people give when they're not sure if something's a joke. I told her it belonged to my late wife. Diane's smile didn't move an inch. "Well," she said, "it certainly has character." She turned back to her conversation like the matter was settled. I picked up my water glass and let it go. Ruth would have told me to. The evening went on that way for a while. Small cuts delivered with a smile. The kind of thing you couldn't point to and say, "Look, this is what's happening." My water glass went unrefilled while every other glass at the table got topped off. When I stepped away to the restroom, I came back to find my chair had been quietly shifted 2 feet further from the group. Nothing dramatic, just a slow, patient chipping away, one polite gesture at a time. Then, near the dessert course, a server near the center of the room stumbled, and a tray rattled, glasses sliding, one nearly toppling. Every head in the ballroom turned for a second toward the sound. And in that half-second of distraction, Diane rose from her seat, crossed toward me with her wine glass in hand, reaching past me for a napkin on the table, and as she pulled her arm back, the shawl slipped from my shoulder and fell half onto the floor. She bent to pick it up, and I watched her hand close around the fabric with more force than picking something up off a floor requires. "Let me just get this out of the way," she said, loud enough for the tables around us to hear. And she pulled, and the old seam at the collar, worn soft from 20 years of wear, gave way with a sound that cut clean through the string quartet's music. Fabric tearing, sharp and final, the kind of sound that leaves no question about what just happened. 300 people heard it. Not one of them made a sound after. The tear ran along the inside collar, the exact place where Ruth had done her embroidery all those years ago, and as the fabric fell open, the stitched letters and the date she'd sewn into the lining came into view, plain as day under the string lights. R.K. to C.A. April 1996. Diane was still holding the torn piece of fabric in her hand when her face went the color of the tablecloth. Her wine glass slipped from her other hand and hit the floor, and the sound of it shattering seemed to echo through that whole quiet room. "Where?" she said, her voice thin and strange. "Where did you get this?" I hadn't planned for this exact moment. I want to be honest about that. I'd planned for the land, for the paperwork, for the reporter standing quietly near the bar with his notebook tucked into his jacket. I had not planned for Ruth's private stitching to be the thing that cracked the room open. But some things, I've come to believe, arrange themselves. I told her it belonged to my wife, Ruth Kessler, and that she'd passed 6 years ago. Diane's mouth opened and nothing came out for a long moment. Across the room, I saw Dr. Voss set his glass down on the bar with a deliberate click, the sound of a man who has made a decision and needs his hands free. He walked to the center of the room, stopping at a careful distance between me and the Ashford table, and he looked at me with an expression I recognized from the hospital hallway 6 weeks earlier. "Mr. Kessler," he said, "I believe I owe your family an explanation I've been waiting 29 years to give." Charles made a sound low in his chest. "Not quite a word," I told Doctor. Voss, he didn't owe me anything. That this wasn't something I'd brought him here to say for me. But if he wanted to say it, I'd stand right here and let him. He turned to Charles. Charles, I've known you 20 years, and I need you to hear this clearly. The reason you were in that ballroom for your son's graduation, the reason you walked him down the aisle at his own wedding rehearsal last month, is a woman named Ruth Kessler. In April of 1996, she gave you a kidney. She never told her husband the truth about that surgery until 3 years ago. She never told anyone. She used the hospital reimbursement to help pay for her daughter's schooling, and she carried that secret to her grave. The room had the particular quality of 300 people collectively forgetting to breathe. Charles Ashford sat down. Not chose to sit. Exactly. His legs simply stopped holding him up, and he lowered himself into the nearest chair, the way a structure settles, when what's been holding it up shifts beneath it. His hand went to his chest. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "It was you," he said, the words barely a whisper, broken clean in half by something that didn't have a name yet. "All this time, and it was your wife." I stood there in the middle of that ballroom, with what was left of my wife's shawl in my hands, and I felt Grace's hand find my arm from somewhere beside me, gripping hard enough that I felt it in the bone. I didn't look away from Charles Ashford. The ache in my arm didn't matter at all. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the envelope Eleanor Wraith had prepared. I walked it down to where Charles sat and laid it on the white tablecloth in front of him. "This is the historic preservation filing for the Millport Hollow Cemetery, the Creek Corridor, and the Community Garden," I said. "Submitted this morning at 6:40. Everything is under automatic hold pending review. Your company's acquisition plans for that land are finished, and I'm sorry you had to find that out tonight of all nights." Charles looked down at the envelope. He looked up at me. His face held about 6 different things at once, none of them anything I expected to see on a man like him. "I didn't know," he said, "about any of it. The land, or her." I told him I believed that. That's the only reason I was telling him myself instead of letting his lawyers find out on Monday morning. Preston hadn't moved from his seat this whole time. His face had gone the color of old ash. His mouth slightly open like a word had started and lost its way. I looked at him and said his name, and he flinched like I'd struck him. "Preston," I said, keeping my voice even enough for the whole room to hear, because that room had spent the evening forming an opinion of my family based on half the story, and they deserved the rest of it. "You knew Ashford Land Holdings had its sights on Millport Hollow. You knew, and instead of coming to me, or to Grace, you signed a consulting agreement and handed them what they needed. You walked through that cemetery where my father is buried. You sat at my table and ate cornbread made from my wife's recipe, and then you went home and sent them photographs of the boundary lines." Preston made a sound I won't try to describe. I told him I wasn't saying this to destroy him. I was saying it because he was 29 years old, standing in a room full of people about to walk away with a version of who he was, and he needed to decide, right now, tonight, whether that was the man he wanted to be. Not for them, for himself. Grace hadn't said a word this whole time, but I saw her studying her fiancé with an expression I recognized. The look of water just before it starts to boil, everything still on the surface, while everything happens underneath. Then she reached into her clutch and pulled out a folded set of papers and set them on the table in front of Preston with a sound louder than it had any right to be. "Since we're all learning things tonight," she said, looking at him steady and calm, "I thought this might be a good time to add a few more." Preston looked at the papers. He didn't touch them. "Open it," Grace said. "That's not a request." His hands shook as he unfolded them. The acquisition file with his name in the community liaison section. The consulting agreement with his signature at the bottom. Grace told him she'd found it 3 weeks earlier going through paperwork at the firm, that she'd sat on it because she needed proof, not suspicion, before she said anything to anyone. "You knew about the land," Grace said. "Did you know she'd hurt my mother's memory to hide it?" "I didn't know she'd do that," Preston said, his voice cracking. "I swear to you, I didn't know she'd do that." "You thought it wouldn't matter," Grace said. "You thought a cemetery full of people nobody important remembers wouldn't matter." I stepped forward and put my hand on Charles Ashford's shoulder, not unkindly, just enough to steady the room, and I told everyone gathered there that this was my family, that I loved my daughter and I loved the memory of my wife, and that what mattered now wasn't punishment, It was whether the people left standing were willing to become something better than what had brought us to this moment. Diane still stood a few feet away, holding the torn shawl, staring at the stitched letters like they might rearrange themselves into something less true. She looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd known her, there was nothing sharp in her face at all. Just something that looked a great deal like shame finally arriving somewhere it had been headed for a long time. We didn't stay much longer. Grace drove me home that night in my own truck because my hands weren't quite steady enough, and we didn't talk for the first 20 minutes. Not because there was nothing to say, but because some things need quiet before they can be spoken. When she finally did talk, she asked if I'd known about her mother and Charles Ashford before that night. I told her I hadn't known who, only that something didn't sit right, and that's why I'd made sure Dr. Voss would be in that room. She asked why I hadn't told her about the land dispute sooner. I told her I hadn't wanted her carrying the weight before I had something solid enough to hand her. She was quiet a moment longer. Then she said maybe I should have told her anyway. She was right. I've had time to sit with that. Charles Ashford came to my door 11 days later. No jacket, no tie, holding an envelope in each hand like a man who'd spent 2 hours arguing with himself in his car before working up the nerve to knock. I let him in. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Ruth had told me her secret 3 years before she died. And I made coffee, because that's what you do, even for a man whose company tried to take your family's land. He told me he'd hired investigators twice over the years trying to find the person who saved his life, and both times come up empty because Dr. Voss had honored her wish completely. He said he used to think the donor must have passed, because he couldn't imagine any other reason someone like that would simply vanish from the world without ever being thanked. I told him she hadn't vanished. She'd just gone back to her life. He left the envelopes on the table. One held a personal letter he asked me to read whenever I was ready. The other held a certified check, more money than I'd seen in one place in my whole life. He told me it wasn't payment, that there was no number that could settle a debt like this one, but that he needed to offer something, because doing nothing felt worse than doing the wrong thing. I told him the land mattered more to me than the money ever could. He said the acquisition had already been formally withdrawn that morning, every filing pulled, and that his company would fund whatever remained of the preservation process through to the end, so that Millport Hollow would be protected permanently, not just held off for now. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I told him there was one more thing. My father is buried in that cemetery, along with people whose names I've spent my whole life making sure nobody forgets. That ground doesn't get touched. Not now, not ever, not by anyone, he said, without hesitating. Agreed. The preservation nomination was approved by the County Historical Commission 88 days after it was filed. Eleanor called me at 7 in the morning to tell me, and there was a warmth in her voice that her usual professional calm couldn't quite contain. Permanent, she told me. The cemetery, the creek corridor, the garden, all of it, protected for good. I asked her to say the word one more time, just so I could hear it again. Permanent. I already knew what it meant. I just wanted to hear it said out loud. Danny Ruiz's article ran in the Sentinel 3 weeks after the shower. Careful and thorough. The kind of piece that trusts its subject to carry the weight, without needing to dress it up. He wrote about the acquisition strategy, the cemetery, the families who'd kept that garden alive for 60 years. He never mentioned Preston's name. He wrote about the anonymous fund that had quietly supported transplant families for over 2 decades, crediting it only to a private donor who'd spent years looking for someone he could never find. Preston called me 4 times in the 2 weeks after the shower. I didn't answer any of them. He left one voicemail I listened to twice sitting in my truck before my shift. 40 seconds of a young man trying to find words that weren't ready yet. He said he understood if I never called back. He said he was going to earn it, however long that took. Grace told me 2 months later that Preston had started driving out to Millport Hollow on his own, walking the creek bank alone for an hour at a time. She'd followed him once, just to make sure he was all right. She said he told her he didn't know how to fix what he'd done. She told him he hadn't fixed it. He'd started, and that starting today instead of tomorrow was the only thing that counted from here on out. I thought about that for a long time, sitting on my porch with a coffee gone cold. Grace was right, the way she usually is. Ruth's shawl sits in the cedar box again now, the torn seam mended by a woman at the fabric shop downtown who didn't ask questions, just did careful work with careful hands. I take it out sometimes, on quiet evenings, and I run my thumb over the stitched letters at the collar. R, K, to C, A. I understand now why she never explained them. Some things you carry so the weight stays yours alone until the day it doesn't have to be anymore. I've lived 66 years, and here's what I know for certain. The land matters. The work matters. The people who show up without being asked matter more than anything money has ever built. I don't call this a revenge story, though I know some of you will. What I felt standing in that ballroom wasn't revenge. It was the truth, finally arriving on time, after 29 years of waiting for the right room to walk into. If this story meant something to you tonight, leave me a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Share it with somebody who needs to hear it. And if you want to hear what comes next, stay close, because there's more waiting. A quick note before you go. This story contains fictional elements created for reflection and storytelling. Some details have been shaped for narrative purposes. If it's not for you, that's all right. There's something out there for everybody, and I hope you find yours.